Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome our guests, panelists, and thank you all for joining us for this webinar, book launch event for the edited volume, Citizens, Civil Society, and Activism under the EPRDF Regime in Ethiopia, an analysis from below. I'd like to thank you on behalf of Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program and the Program on Law Society in the Muslim World. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Harvard African Law Association and the Harvard Center for African Studies. Before we begin, let me go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is recorded, and the recording will be made available on our social media platforms at a future date. We plan to have a 30-minute main session with about 7 minutes allotted to each panelist. This will be followed by a 30 to 45-minute discussion session. Our audience will be muted throughout this Zoom webinar. However, you may enter your questions at any time during the webinar into the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can during the discussion. In the Zoom message sections, you will find information on how to subscribe to the Human Rights Program's newsletter. For those interested in purchasing the book, please note that a 30% discount code has been provided in your confirmation email. I'm excited to welcome our panelists. Dr. Camille Pellerin is one of the editors of the subject of today's book. She is a researcher at the Department of Government at Uppsala University. Her research focuses on state-society relations, exploring different dimensions such as civic activism, trade unionism, democratic reform, and urban protests. Camille has been awarded funding as a co-investigator and a principal investigator from the prestigious Swedish Research Council for research on state labor relations and minimum wage negotiations in Ethiopia. Abdulatif Idris is a PhD candidate at Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, and he is a lecturer at the Center for Human Rights at Addis Ababa University. His research interests include intercultural human rights, environmental and indigenous peoples' rights, comparative constitutional and administrative law, federalism, and multi-level governance. Abdulatif is widely regarded as a thoughtful scholar and advocate for human rights law in the human rights law community, and he's considered to be a mentor by many of his former students who now populate the human rights field in Ethiopia. Befeqadu Hailu is a prolific writer, blogger, and a pro-democracy activist in Ethiopia. He's a recipient of the CPJ International Press Freedom Award, the Penn Printer Prize for International Writer of Courage, the Burt Award for African Literature in Ethiopia. He is a co-founder and executive director of the Center for the Advancement of Rights and Democracy, a leading human rights organization in Ethiopia. Befeqadu was a co-founder of the Zone 9 Collective in 2015 and a pro-democracy activist who spent 596 days in detention as retribution for the success of his work. Dr. Faiz Mohammed Qasim is an assistant professor of neuropsychopharmacology at the Department of Psychiatry at St. Paul's Hospital, Millennium Medical College in Addis Ababa. Faiz has 2 master's degrees from Addis Ababa University, one in philosophy and another in pharmacology, and has a PhD in the latter. His research ranges from Ethiopian history to secularism and Ethiopian Muslims, and he has published 2 books, one on Islamophobia in Ethiopia and another connected with Ethiopian historiography. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for writing this really interesting book. Dr. Camille Pellerin, let's start with you. For a book that was published this year, I'd say somewhere in July, I think, right? I've not only read your book, but I have come back to reread some parts of it more than one time. I find the book to be empirically very rich. However, one thing I had wondered about was, and never really tackled, was what you wanted to achieve in the book. Why don't we open with what you set out to achieve in this book and start off with the discussion with that?
Thank you, Abade, for this really kind introduction, and also avoids me needing to tell who I am. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today and to introduce our book, Citizens, Civil Society and Activism under the EPRDF Regime in Ethiopia. So what we wanted to achieve with the book is a very good question, and I think primarily we wanted to create a collection of stories about civic activism under authoritarian rule, written from the perspective of civil society actors. And we wanted to do so to challenge the idea that civil society is weak and activism non-existent in such context. The book focuses on the case of Ethiopia during the rule of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF, from 1991 to 2019. And it tells stories of civic activism from below. All contributing authors have really long-standing experience in researching civil society-state relations in Ethiopia. Many are Ethiopians, and some have been or are activists themselves. Given the relative power imbalance between states and citizens in non-democratic settings, a lot of existing literature has emphasized the power and the ability of authoritarian regimes to control civic activism. And the absence of large-scale public contestation, a phenomenon that we have called public silence, has often been taken as a sign that authoritarian governments have successfully suppressed civil society and forced citizens to abide by government directives. But what we argue in this book is that it's important to look beyond the silence, beyond what looks like as an absent civil society, and to study the gray zones of politics to understand how civil society and state actors relate to each other, engage with each other in non-democratic context. And we believe that doing so allows to actually capture a variety of different shades of civic activism and to understand the nature, but also the degree of grievances in the population in such settings. So in the collection, we provide different examples of civic activism, ranging from urban to rural areas. We look at formal and informal civil society actors and citizens under the EPRDF rule. The chapters collectively challenge that the idea that there has not been contestation. And though it becomes clear that contestation has not easily been visible in many cases, it has existed quite widespread. And in the EPRDF regime in Ethiopia has been mostly portrayed as a top-down state that has controlled civil society with an iron fist. But the chapters provide evidence that the EPRDF has been challenged by civil society and citizens during the full duration of its rule, so from 1991 to 2019. And sometimes overtly, but in many cases, more through covert forms and subversion of power structures. Mostly the EPRDF resolved to repressing civic activism, but in some cases, it has needed to actually accommodate demands made. So the relationships that we capture between civil society and state actors range from cooptation, where the government or the ruling coalition used to control civic activism, to full-blown contestation in forms of public protests over varying degrees of collaboration between state and civil society actors and coexistence. We also show that the relationship between state and civil society actors has not been stable, but some civil society actors have gravitated away from state powers, while others have gravitated towards state power. And some civil society organizations used to have quite good collaboration with some state actors, but were in conflict with others. So in general, state power, we show, has been challenged in different ways, and citizens and civil society actors really adapted to the restrictive environment. You could say that we have a normative research agenda in the book. We render the voices of usually silenced actors audible, and we counter dominant state-centric readings of civil society relations under authoritarian rule. But we do not adopt a normative definition of civil society. The book also demonstrates that some civil society actors actually advanced non-democratic or particularistic agendas. The collection, I would say, is a beginning. We contribute a really small amount of possible counter-narratives. We draw together on a variety of different methods in the different chapters. What unites us is our long-term engagement with the research questions, both as academics and, as said, in some instances also activists. And what I personally really think makes this book quite special is that it's not simply a piece of research, but it's a book talking about issues that are really close to the hearts of all contributing authors. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. Abdulatif, let's turn to you. You co-authored with Camille the chapter I've visited the most, and I have so many things to say, but let me hold those back and leave it, hand the mic over to you, so you present your chapter and your impressions and your contributions to the overall goal of the book. Abdulatif, proceed, and the others, we can mute ourselves.
Okay, again, so again, thank you, Abader, for organizing this platform so that we can discuss the book that came out back in July. So again, maybe it's I'll just go through what we did and what I think are our contributions. So our chapter appears as the last one in the book, and it kind of, in terms of chronology, maybe it's a sort of an epilogue kind of account to the EPRDF era, because we don't talk much about what happened during the clean EPRDF era of the pre-2000 time. So what we did in this chapter is basically to give an account of the legal reform regulating civil society organizations that obviously initiated during the early days of the transition in 2018, and also account for how, at least initial accounts of how that legal reform fared after the law was adopted. And the basic material for our research was basically gathered, of course, jointly by and individually by myself and Camille. As you, Abader, and maybe some will know that I was involved in the drafting process within the working group at the Ministry of Justice, the then Attorney General, working to draft or to reform the law. And my participation was not limited to the working group, but also, as you know, the secretariat of the advisory council, so which gave me a lot of privileged access to the in and outs of that reform process. So the first part, that's most of some of where the material came from. And Camille was, of course, a veteran civil society researcher in Ethiopia, but more concretely for this chapter, she was engaged with the agency post-reform in terms of implementing and capacity building initiatives at the agency through consultancy engagements. So this is what basically accounts for our data. And in terms of also presentation, we give an account for the main question of how civil societies are able to contest power and influence things that happen, is basically in two parts again. I think the overall picture is during the reform period for multiple reasons, and not necessarily for the things that the civil society organizations did only during that opening period, but also what they did throughout, in terms of producing a lot of material, building, a sort of what they call knowledge basis. When time came for reform, then they were able to influence quite a bit. And that was, I think, we also argue that allowed at least a pushback against entrenched interests within the regime, to push back against radical reform. I think the CSOs, we can say, were more successful in getting their way in terms of how the new legislation was drafted. But again, the picture, I would say, once the law came out, I would say there, like, the structural weaknesses kind of resurfaced in terms of the actual implementation. There were obvious and manifest shortcomings, and because of, again, very persistent structural weaknesses within civil society organizations and that basically ecosystem, they were not able to effectively monitor the implementation of the law, to hold the agency to account, and then a lot of clawback process and the clawback, I don't know, attempts were, I think, successfully done at the agency. I think maybe if I can say now this much in terms of the overall chapter, I think it should be enough for now.
Thank you, Abdul Latif. Faiz, your chapter, which was co-authored with Daraja Faisa, takes on one of the most important turning points in EPRDF rule, not just in terms of state-religion relations, but also from a point of view of the rise of civil society protests, which one may argue was the ferment that led to the 2018 transition. Let's give you the word before we turn to Bafakadu. You're muted, by the way.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Abadir, for moderating this wonderful book launching. In general, our book chapter, it was entitled as a non-violent struggle against the EPRDF's hegemony. It was the case of the Muslim protests. Just to introduce what was really going in the last 14th century in Ethiopia. Just the relationship, it was between Islam and Ethiopia, it was so dynamic and complex, and it can be considered as Islam and Ethiopia had been had complex relationship, dynamic relationship, which was as old as Islam itself. And Muslims affectionately refer to Ethiopia, it was a country, home country of the first Hijrah. So we can mention lots of things and some research has already exposed and demonstrated what the Islam and the Muslims relationship had been. The most important thing to describe our chapter, it was the reform that had been taken place in the last 50 and 60 years in Ethiopia, particularly the 1974 up to that of the 1991 reforms and the revolution. They brought long-lasting change towards the relationship between state and the religion in Ethiopia. So those reforms, they provided that the emergence of a confident and assertive Ethiopian Muslim community. But what was particularly surprising to that was the most sustained protest and the challenge came from a marginalized religious group, the Muslims community, EPRDF, mainly after the 1991 reform, it was claiming that it had liberated such kinds of marginalized religious group. So in this chapter, we try to discuss the transformation of EPRDF-Muslim relationship, mainly from that of the political alliances to confrontation in the context of authoritarianism. In such like a discussion, we provided like 4 kinds of section, or like we structured in 4 sections. The first section was what was really the underlying political collaboration, or like that of alliance between EPRDF and the Muslim community. The second section, like we tried to discuss the contentious issue in such relationship between EPRDF and the Muslims. Mainly, like we tried to analyze how the cooptation contributed to this deterioration. And the third section mainly described the genesis and the trajectory of the Muslim protests, mainly like how the contestation was generated. And the last section, it discussed the various protest strategies used and how they, like the Muslim community, were successfully deployed to contest and challenge that of the omnipotent, or like the most authoritarian regime in that period. So in the first chapter, in the first section, like we tried to discuss like from the alliance to tension relationship between the EPRDF and that of the Muslim community and that of the activism. Importantly, what was the crux was the EPRDF's master narrative was one of like considering the ethnic marginalization, though like it doesn't mean like it was only like inclined to that of ethnic marginalization. Still, it was a kind of like adopting, albeit like it was a kind of secondary law. A religious marginalization narrative was also part of the EPRDF's narration, as we all know that one. But when we come to that of religious marginalization narrative, it was a kind of real politic, or a kind of political pragmatism than a normative commitment to religious identity. So in such real like narrative, which was not like a primary issue or narrative to that regime, finally it started to bring that the narratives of Muslim activists, mainly they were saying that the primary religious injustice were commonly like that was inclined to the marginalized religious groups commonly. So they were claiming that religious injustice were paramount and very important in Ethiopian history. So like they were claiming against what the EPRDF was like standing for, narrating. So the second part, the contentious issues were mainly the Muslim communists, particularly those of the activists, raising commonly like it was the religious demographics of the 2007 and that of the call for deepening of religious freedom and equality. We can also mention that of the quest for autonomous representative body, that of the Majlis organization, the securitization of Islamic reform movements by the EPRDF, and vis-a-vis that of the global war on terror, and that of also the commonly the narration of the Sufi Salafi binary from the EPRDF. Finally, like it came with the Ahbash debacle and that of the catastrophe that saw the relationship between the community and the activist and that of the EPRDF government. And the third part, like we try to discuss the genesis and the trajectory of the Muslim protest. So this was commonly because of the like the Ahbash debacle. It showed the culmination of the simmering tension over the years between EPRDF and that of the Muslim community. So commonly it started with the Ahbash training, so that the specific like religious group that was supported by the EPRDF. So the protest strategies were very various resistance strategies, but was the most successful non-violent struggle against EPRDF's tight grip over the Ethiopian society. So in that, the important factors were, or the important move were articulating the contours of a non-violent struggle by the leaders, resistant as the sacred sites. It were like a trajectory of the Muslim protest. We can also like add number of like symbolic movements, like protest inside the mosque, election inside the mosque, that were commonly practiced by the activists and the community which followed them. The Sadaqah and the Unity program, the Salat Man, the prison wedding, that was also a special event turned into resistance. We tried the chapter to recover such event. Finally, the Muslim protest has entered the annals of Ethiopian history through that non-violent movement. It was very successful in a non-violent struggle against the oppressive regime, which ultimately achieved the protesters' central demand. More importantly, what the chapter discussed and we found is that this non-violent movement will be remembered for its contribution to the broader democratic policies in Ethiopia. So finally, that movement turned into that of the broader, the Cairo movement. Finally, it was like another reform throughout the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Faiz. Since Bafekado was aware that he was joining us from a place that has patchy connectivity, he sent us a pre-recorded video. And Bafekado might be able to join us if he gets internet connection. And I'm happy he sent us a video because it apparently is not succeeding in joining. So let's play a pre-recorded video from Bafekado, and we will then turn to the discussion and Q&A session with or without Bafekado. Kai, could you play the video, please? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bafekado. I am one of the writers in this book. I wrote about urban and online activism. Before I start, I would like to apologize everyone for not being able to attend this meeting live instead of sending a recorded video. Unfortunately, I'm traveling to the southern part of Ethiopia and I'm not sure if I can find a reliable internet connection. Second, I would like to thank both of the editors of the book and especially Kami for making my chapter more intellectual than it was. And also I would like to thank the Human Rights Program for facilitating this launch program. Now I will try to briefly tell you the story of Zone 9 Blogging and Activism Collective. As you might know, the story of Zone 9 starts with its name, because the name Zone 9 itself defined the purpose for which the group worked. By the time we founded the Zone 9 Blogging and Activism Collective, there were 8 zones in the Kaliti prison, and there were many political prisoners who were detained in most of the zones. Those political prisoners used to call the outside area, the outside of the prison, as Zone 9, because they believed that a majority of the population who are living outside of the prison compound are living in fear, and their freedoms are restricted or imprisoned. So we thought that would be a nice name to take for our collective, and then it was on 13th of May 2012 that we decided to create this group after we found the name. And in our activism, we have highlighted that Ethiopia is a place where political and civic rights are restricted. The engagements of Zone 9 were 3 in their types. The first one is blogging. Most of all of the members of the blog and also other colleagues and friends have contributed critical commentaries on the socio-political issues of Ethiopia, and we have produced hundreds of blogs in our stay as a collective. The second type of engagement we had was campaigning. Well, if the blogs have actually created a community for us, a political community, but the campaigns have broadened our influence. We started campaigning on the respect of constitution. We demanded the government to respect the very constitution it is meant to abide by. And also we requested for freedom of expression, for freedom of assembly. And we at a point campaigned for Ethiopian dream. That call was to request society and government at large to build democratic and inclusive society. Our campaigns were lucky enough to receive media attention. Al Jazeera, BBC, and VOA have reported about the campaigns, and also some human rights organizations like CPJ, Article 19, Freedom House, Civil Rights Defenders, Frontline Defenders. Some of them joined our campaigns, especially when we campaigned for freedom of expression and freeing of imprisoned journalists, but others facilitated opportunities for us to get capacity building opportunities. Before that, we were activists accidentally, and we did not have what it takes to actually influence society and government in our workers. The third type of engagement was prison visits. We used to go to Kaliti, Kilinto, and Zuwai prisons to visit journalists and other political prisoners, and we reported back on the conditions of the prisoners and sometimes the messages those prisoners have to the public. So by blogging, campaigning, and prison visits, we built a large community and network, and also the trust of many people. So in the process, we have been learning a lot, but also the government was also learning that we are growing stronger and critical. So they started to, silence us. The first incident was one of our colleagues, Zelalem Kibret, who was a lecturer of law at Ambo University in Oromia, was tortured in the OPDO office of EPRDF. Then some of our colleagues and friends were approached by people who identified themselves as intelligence officers, and they started, the physical surveillance also started to grow, and it became a matter of days before we were detained, and then that day became to be April 25, 2014, just after 2 years of our founding. In our detention, the first 3 months were horrible. We have been tortured, interrogated, and we have no or little access to lawyers and visitors. After 3 months of detention in the notorious Maakalawi prison, we were sent to Kilinto, and we were formally charged with the bogus terrorism charges. But fortunately for us, some of our colleagues who were not detained and who reside abroad in Kenya, in the US, started to campaign, and their campaign was joined by international human rights organizations and also other bloggers across the world. It is one of the most campaigned cases, and many international organizations, embassies, and others have considered the case of Zone 9 as a showcase of Ethiopia's repression to civil society and freedom of expression. So one by one, the government started to drop our charges, and we were finally freed after 18 months of imprisonment. So during our imprisonment, it was difficult, but one of our co-defendants, Mahalet Fantaun, she said to me once that consider this imprisonment as a big campaign, which is better and stronger than what we did when we were outside. So those kinds of things in the reports we hear about the global campaign happening abroad kept us going. So when we were released, we were not weakened. In fact, our effort as a collective has declined, but individually we have been monitoring court cases, we have been reporting about what they do to prisoners in Malawi and a lot of things. So along with our efforts, there were coordinated, protests, public oppositions, and so on. Change was coming, and Malawi was decided to be closed. And once my charges were dropped, I went to the compound of Malawi, and I arrived to see the name board of Malawi was shattered down. And one of the guards who recognized me from my activism said to me that you guys got this place closed. And that statement has always, ringed in my ears as, as a bell of success. In fact, our suffering was not in vain. We have contributed some things. And at the end, Zone 9, it was an informal group, and it has died its natural days. As its legacy, its members have continued their engagements in different forms, and some of them continued their private lives. Among some of us who are engaged in public life, some of us are engaged in media, some of us are engaging in civil society organization. We are trying to do bigger activities than we did in Zone 9. Others served public institutions, others joined political organization, and so on. But the lesson for us is that Zone 9 was zero budget movement, but it could reach to the hearts of many citizens, and it indeed contributed to the change in government, whatever the outcome or the after the post developments of the changes in government. So this is what I can tell you about my chapter. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Have a good day.
Excellent. If you could turn on your videos now and turn on your mics as well. Okay, there I am. If panelists could turn on their videos and their mics now, so we have, Bafakado has also joined us. Thank you, Bafakado, for the video and for the presentation. Now we'll get into the discussion phase, and I invite participants to throw their questions in the Q&A box or the Q&A function of Zoom. And while that is happening, let me throw out a couple of thoughts and questions for the panelists to openly comment on. First, let me say not just Bafakado's presentation, but this book overall takes us back to a time of struggle and time of hope that followed, and the time that followed after that. So it's a little bit of a personal and emotional story in terms of, in addition to being an academic book. And Bafakado's presentation reminded me of one thing, which was probably, I should say, unfortunately, there was a culture of resistance where Bafakado and his colleagues were imprisoned, and many others were imprisoned. I remember there was a sense of that was a sign of success in terms of activism, in that, if the government decides to arrest you and accuse you of terrorism or any of those serious crimes, that was a sign of an objective sign of success. And there was also a culture of congratulating each other when these things were happening amongst people who were previously arrested. I would say, especially if someone has an arrest warrant against them, but they aren't arrested, people would reach out and congratulate them because it was seen as a sign of, successful resistance. Let me throw out a couple of thoughts and questions. So we have, from Zone 9 to the Msachinissama to the Cairo movement and the NGOs that were covered in this conversation. All of them were represented an anti-authoritarian and activist trend. I was wondering if you could give us examples of what collaboration, you can call it collaboration. I don't think you used the word vernacularization. I think collaboration was the word you were using. What does collaboration in order to create space, to create independent space, not just, maybe influence decisions but forget about influence, but create an independent space in an increasingly authoritarian governance structure looked like taking away the anti-authoritarianist and activist and pro-democracy part of the movement. And maybe in one of the chapters, the Women's Development Army is covered. But then outside of that as well, there's a lot of diversity, as you said, Kami, in the civil society space. I don't know what the most numerous civil society institutions, maybe the Adr and Uqubs in the cities and in the countryside, or indigenous urban, peri-urban institutions that predate the Ethiopian state as well exist in this space. I'm wondering, what collaboration looks like that wouldn't qualify as resistance or pro-democracy activism. And the other question or thought I had was regarding relations between different groups, civil society groups that were discussed today, for example. The reason I'm asking the relation between those is primarily motivated or provoked by the post-2018 phase where you do have more of a dynamic, changes in the positions of different groups. And Kami, that goes into the non-stability of the relationship you mentioned earlier. But I don't want to ask about the post-2018. I'm wondering, even within pre-2018, what did competition between different groups look like, whether the groups that were discussed or outside of the groups? Let me just throw it back to you and have maybe Kami, I can start with you, and then Abdulatif, Faiz, and Bafakadu, you can jump in.
Thank you, Abadar. I will start, and I will rely on the others to jump in and also help answering the questions. Your first question is about what did collaboration look like between civil society organizations and an increasingly authoritarian state. And there, I think the first caveat is there were some sectors or some topics were much more considered sensitive by the government than others. So what Bafakadu and the Zone 9 bloggers were working on, human rights activism, was probably among the most sensitive topics. And more what we have a chapter about NGOs working in service provision that was considered probably as less politically sensitive. So in the areas considered as less politically sensitive, in general, there has been more opportunities for CSOs to collaborate with the government to push their agendas. But I think what we have seen in the chapter by Gebre Ntiso, who's writing about service providing NGOs, is that especially in more rural areas, the government under the EPRDF regime lacked quite a lot of budget to respond to quite basic service provision needs within the population. And some CSOs have used the fact that the government has needed budget to negotiate space for action. So knowing that the government in the sense to keep stability as much as possible and avoid people avoid grievances to go even further up, the government was willing to collaborate even in areas that might have been considered as sensitive, such as women's rights. And so we have seen that service providing NGOs have sometimes as a tit for tat, sometimes as a way to establish trust and then being able to work on more sensitive issues. So that's probably one example of collaboration that I could name, and I will leave it to the others to jump in with more. And your second question was about competition between different groups in civil society. And yeah, I mean, it is still the case, and it's the case in many developing country contexts, that a lot of more formal CSOs are concentrated in the urban areas. So there already we see the kind of competition for funding very often among these organizations that are competing for donor funding, and at the same time then CSOs in more rural areas that also have constituents and sometimes even much closer contact to their constituents, but are not able to access these resources. And then in this very polarized Ethiopian political context, we also need to talk about that some civil society organizations have advanced quite particularistic agendas. So if we look at the Cairo protests that were discussed in the chapter by Tegvaru, some of the claims, not all of the claims, but some of the claims have advanced particular regional issues, and parts of what started as non-violent protests has also turned into violent protests, and with an ethnic component to it. So civil society in that case has had its internal struggles also when it comes to who are they representing, what are the demands, and so civil society in that sense has not always been civil, but that's nothing new, I would say, to the Ethiopian, or that's nothing particular to the Ethiopian context. But I will hand it over to the others so that I'm not the one dominating the space here.
Abdulatif Faiz, Abdulatif, if you want to jump in? You're on mute.
Yeah, maybe just a few words on collaboration and competition from the perspective of just the legal reform process. Again, chronologically, you can say there was collaboration, I would say even an effective collaboration during the reform process between multiple types of civil society organizations. Of course, pre-2018, there were categories which, or certain organizations which were kind of co-opted or very openly and very effectively very close to the state. Some of them almost parastatal, as we know, these youth leagues and whatnot. I would say in the interest of maybe not ideological, independence or civil society, but at least on material interests or others, they were, I would say, effectively collaborated with one another, not necessarily with the state, to advance their, a more liberal legislative framework, I would say, yeah. But there was still some competition, I would say, even within then. Our data show, and we have, I think, somehow indicated this also in the chapter, where some of these civil society organizations who had a relatively better operating space, either because of some of the personal relationship between the rulers of this or the leaders of these big civil society organizations with party affiliations, who are trying somehow even to undermine some of the more liberal reforms. I would say there was even some competition. So it's a mixed bag, right? It's not clearly like one way or another, but also maybe post-legal reform, once the law came out, again, I think they went back to those competition phase, I would say, where this division, division between newly emerging and newly registered civil society organizations who felt more independent, but still lacking the connections and experience to effectively check. But the older ones maybe also getting back to their older mode of trying to do things. So I would say it's a mixed bag. You can see either more like competition during a certain phase and also collaboration to a certain extent.
You're muted, Avadir.
Sorry. Okay, so in terms of competition, let me add one more observation, Abdulatif, with what you pointed out. I remember also one of the things that I noticed was what Bafakado earlier called the zero budget model of civil society institutions, which were in the forefront of the protests and activism. Seem to have either been actively sidelined or kind of died down after 2018, and you see the rise of the formal NGOs taking the lead in terms of the conversation about democratization. I remember civic engagement was one of those things where you really didn't have the zero budget model, grassroots type institutions in the conversation about democratization. I would say including the legal reform process itself and civic engagement. And then it becomes a professional affair, which is an interesting shift. Possibly, you could see that as competition as well, and competition for visibility, competition for funding, and so on. And speaking of competition, Faiz, was there competition amongst Muslim civil society actors, both pre and post 2018?
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe it would be better first to discuss what kinds of collaboration or a kind of political alliances between the EPRDF and the Muslims really happened. Maybe my connection is quite unstable. Do you hear me, please? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
So I'm far from the capital. The competition came mainly after what EPRDF showed to the Muslim community, after the 1991 revolution and that of the transition. So the Muslim community, different civil society groups, emerged out of the opportunity that EPRDF brought, really, based on the constitution, even if that was indiscriminate, it was to all society. As I said earlier, it was generally based on the ethnic types of marginalization, but the constitution, for the good thing, it brought religious rights, at least on the paper based. So that was it was considered a good opportunity for different Muslim community members, and it was out of the Muslim civil society groups. So initially, different members of the communities, or they established different kinds of civil societies. But finally, what happened was that the government itself formed a kind of binary. So those Muslim societies, based on good Muslims and bad Muslims, taking that the connotations. So that resulted the competition between the Muslims among themselves, to gain more acceptance from based on the religious or in the political ideologies of the government itself. So it is a kind of dynamic, initially based on the alliances or at least default recognition of the religious minorities in Ethiopia. Then after providing paper-based constitutional rights, different civil societies they were able to come to the ground. That resulted in competition.
Thank you, Faiz. Bafakadu is raising his hand and trying to jump in. See if the connection works.
Hi everyone. I think it works. I hope. I wanted to say a few things, especially when it comes to collaboration, because the informal movement somehow collaborated, and especially with Zone 9. I remember our first collaboration was with the feminist groups, informal themselves. One of them was Yellow Movement. Maybe it is because of one of the leaders or the founders who was also attracted in the campaigns of Zone 9. But the first group that openly endorsed us in a way were the feminist group online, and we also somehow evolved to become somehow feminists after that kind of collaboration. Also, we have probably the earliest the earliest collaboration, especially on social media, with Imsachen Yisema movement. I remember most of the committee members and most of the Muslims community were trying to be very careful to avoid political interpretations of their questions. And a former journalist of Addis Nagar wrote a long article on Facebook saying that your question is for religious freedom. So this is a political question and there is nothing wrong about it. And then I remember some of the members of the Zone 9 went into Anwar Mosque on a Friday prayer during the protests. And after the prayers, they used to hold papers on which the article 27, the number 27, which is in reference to the Constitution, was displayed. And one of our campaigns were respect the constitutions, if you remember. So we have gotten that inspiration from that question. So we cannot, this is not included in the chapter, unfortunately, and I just remembered it when the question of collaboration was raised. Also, with the formal civil society organizations, for example, the Ethiopian Human Rights Council back then used to raise funds from local donors, but some of the local donors were scared to donate because their names have to be registered and are to be reported to agency for the civil society organization. So we the Zone 9 members used to sign our names and somebody else donate in our name. So even the people from HERCO used to call us when they find someone who can donate money but are scared of giving the money by signing their names. So these are, I think, good examples of collaboration, and especially in reference to pre-2008 situation. I don't recall any kind of competition, as there were only limited actors in the sector or in the space. Back to you.
Thank you, Bafakadu. I will pull in two questions from the audience members. One says, one asks if the book draws lessons for future ruling parties to learn from. And he or she says, I'm asking this question remembering that what we learn from history is that mankind does not learn from history. The second question was directed to Faiz, and it says, what do you think is the ration of contribution for Muslim struggle has as an impact to EPRDF and sense of peaceful uprising in the country? Let's first start with the first question. And there's another question to Dr. Faiz. In the course of multiple resistance and protest fronts against EPRDF, the government's reactions to crack down against Muslim rights movement was mostly done by regime co-opted Muslims, it says, and surveillance groups to assault Muslims. Question is there research and output on this point with regards to Dimsachini Sama and nonviolent resistance? Abdulatif, maybe let me put these questions to you, and maybe you can also look at the questions in the Q&A function to kind of make sense of them. But let's first start with lessons for the future. And I'm opening this to anyone who wants to pick up on it.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe like just to go first, like with the first questions. In general, as I try to conclude, like the Muslim protest, it was considered like one of the successful non-violent movement in Ethiopia. In addition to that, it showed that how based on like the constitution itself, a peaceful protest in Ethiopia can be initiated, triggered, and that can be like peacefully practiced, and how the objectives can be successfully achieved. In addition to that, the Muslim protest has also inspired similar protests by other groups of people. For example, like mobilization with explicit political agendas later adopted the strategic and the tactical the Muslim peaceful protest. Even though that as we discussed like explicitly the chapter, it was religious as well as it was like non-violent and non-political as well. I mean, it was mainly like with the essential focus on that of the religious questions, the three religious questions. So finally, when the Oromo protest broke out, as you know, like in 2014, 2015, like it demanded political inclusion and accountability. It used the same tools, surprisingly, that had been used by Dimsachini Sama or the non-violent movements or protests of that of the Muslims. Just like that, the Cairo movement, so-called, it used to organize and mobilize the Oromo youth. Mainly, like it used the symbols, the strategies, and the paths by like making it political. So generally, the Muslim protest showed that any kind of questions or any kind of like concern that any citizens or communities or civil societies they want to provide to the government or like to any agent can be provided in a non-violent way. The strategies it used, it was also exemplary in the country, and the other, so it was also adopted by other movements in the countries that were finally successful. And I will come to the second question later.
There was also an overlap and continuity as well between the different movements, right? Like, for example, from the Dimsachini Sama to Cairo, it's not always a clear, or Dimsachini Sama, Zone 9, and all these movements have some overlap in terms of timeline and personnel and ideas and tactics and styles. There's a smooth continuity between these things rather than different sets of people, different sets of groups. Let me also throw in quick comments about maybe there was, in addition to overlap and continuity, I think one thing that should be emphasized was the solidarity between the different movements as well, which was, I mean, very interesting in terms of both the solidarity and how they framed the different movements in ways that don't oppose each other. I will also add, and this is jumping from Bafakado's comment about the creativity of the different movements was really interesting. And even the names, Article 27, as you mentioned, Zone 9 itself, which Befeqadu started with, which was an ingenious, way of framing that movement. Even Dimzachin Sama, the word itself, even the Kero narrative itself. These were really creative ways of protest and creative ways of framing these protests, and the different organizing styles and ways of working around the security system. Let me hand it back. Abdulatif, were you jumping in?
Well, very briefly on the question of lessons to be drawn. Well, of course, I'm not directly addressing the way the question is framed for future ruling parties. They'll have to pay for it, maybe. Well, that's a kind of advice. But in terms of how effective civil society contestation of power can be, I think the lesson we find, at least from our chapter in the law reform process, is basically years and years of advocacy, years and years of knowledge building, years and years of what the policy alternatives that are advocated for, published for. I think the lesson is, at least when the state is somehow vulnerable and weak and amenable, then the kind of ideas you have developed over the years will be the most influential, and will have a chance of at least getting legislated and influencing future policy. So I think that's one best lesson. So in terms of at least policy relevance, if anybody is considering whether or not it's worth to invest during the times of, so to say, gloom, maybe they will pay down the line. So it's not all doom and gloom. Maybe that's one lesson I can probably point out at this point.
Thank you, Abdulatif. Anyone else? And there are other questions in the back end as well. See if you can look. I think Abdulatif, Faiz is getting the most number of questions. But in the meantime, maybe Kami, do you have any comments on the previous set of questions?
Just also a comment on the question that Abdulatif just commented on, and I will also avoid the part lessons learned for ruling parties, but I think lessons learned in general, what the book demonstrates, because it really looks at different types of examples from 91 then up to 2019, is civil society ideally constitutes a form of safety valve. It's a form of expressing demands of citizens informing states, and the EPRDF wasn't willing to listen, and it tried its very best to repress and control. And while the activism continued existing in different forms, urban, rural, formal and informal, it was very difficult for actors to operate. But that didn't prevent the pot from boiling over. So since civil society could not constitute this type of safety valve, eventually grievances boiled over, and they boiled over in a way that was extremely difficult to control. So for formal organizations, the EPRDF was able to take away licenses, to threaten leaders, and so on. But social movements are different beasts, and they're more difficult to control. And I think that we already saw with the Zone 9 as a more informal group was more difficult to control, and eventually the only way to control it was these bogus terrorism charges. And so kind of the book really tells the story, and I think quite convincingly, how the activism existed, but how the fact that repression was the main tool of the EPRDF to handle eventually also became its weak spot.
Thank you, Kami. I mean, since everyone is shying away from giving what the lessons for authoritarian regimes are, let me try to do that. The lesson is don't do it. But on a serious note, I mean, it's a lesson, also a lesson of coercion by itself doesn't really make for rulership. You just can't simply rely on coercion to run a country, I think, is is a lesson for authoritarians as well. But yes, I do agree with the spirit of not turning this into advice to authoritarians. Faiz, the mic is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe like to just to comment on Mr. Abdul Latif's concern or issue. Like I think he was asking, like the regime was like using regime coopting Muslims in the surveillance group. The issue was like the objective was not like what kinds of the subgroups in the regime were like using what kinds of like some strategies or some kinds of surveillance, because we're considering the regime as a regime, not like individual based or based on like some subgroups or some parties or some individual members like in that region. So like even the title itself, the title of the book as well as our like chapter title, it is under EPRDF. So like really it was out of the scope of the book itself and particularly to the chapter itself. But as far as I am concerned to your second question, Mr. Abdul Latif, as far as like I know, like no huge research has been done. Like even though like number of like professionals and individuals, they tried their best to contribute the kind of like articles, maybe book chapters or some kinds of collections. But still, this one is most untouched topic in recent Ethiopian scenarios and events. Like so, I hope it will be investigated like in detail in near future. Maybe to the second question, to the third question, Katis, if like could I continue, please, Mr. Abadu?
Yes, please. Yes, please. And after you, I'll wrap it up after you.
Okay. Yeah. And yeah, it was like an interesting question, like as like the other Mr. Abdul Latif and the other asked. Well, I really like we try to explain the concern you raised, like is important, like in the introduction of our book chapter, like if the relationship between the state, like Ethiopia and that of the Muslims, it was not a kind of static, even it is not a kind of homogeneous. It was heterogeneous based on like the specific regions, like in the northeastern part of Ethiopia, in the southeastern part. It was so complex, even the central, the Shoa Sultanate. So we can mention lots of things, but just to put it precisely, it was dynamic and it was quite complex. So after or post 1999, even that 25 or something period, it was by itself complex because we tried to show that the structure, the relationship of the structure itself was like initially based on the collaboration, then there were like contestation, then finally there were confrontation. So we tried to discuss like that one, and the evolution quite, even if it is not pure, it was a kind of linear, like from confrontation to that of cooptation, then contestation, finally to confrontation. So it was not, you asked me individually, the good thing, like we were a good observers in that event in the Dimsachi Sama, and my colleague, Darija Fayisa, like he was also a good observer with different literatures, different. Also, we interviewed different individuals who were involved with mainly as like the activists, as the leaders, the Muslim Arbitration Committee, and the different individuals like from inside and from outside. So, if you ask me individually, I was a good observer, and Dr. Darija was more observer than me. Thank you.
Thank you, Faiz. Well, this was time flies when you have these interesting conversations. You know, I think this book and to a limited extent, this conversation has rendered silent actors visible and audible. And I hope you are able to look at this book, read this book, and look at all, you know, the rendering and capturing of this moment in which, I mean, to the extent possible, I don't think it's even possible, but this book is successful in at least capturing a couple of pictures, a couple of snaps of these moments in which shades of civil activism is taking place, contestation and challenge is taking place, collaboration is taking place among civil society, among government and civil society, and in the context of co-option and coercion on the government side as well. So all these things are going on at the same time with civic organizations, some of them pro-democracy, some not, some, all these things taking place at the same time is usually not looked at when you look at politics and political dynamics, the focus being on the regime and governments and their actions. And I think this book does a really great job in illustrating that. I think the word Faiz used was dynamism, the dynamism of political moments. So with that, I invite you to read the book. And I'd like to thank our audience, participants and panelists for making the time to talk to us. And with that, we wind down this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a nice time.
Have a nice evening, all of you. I think have a nice evening to everyone except me.
All participants, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for joining.